Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 4. It was bright when he woke. The tent was empty, and everything, to his great disappointment, still ached. Ink was smeared on his arm where he had put it down on the paper to rest his eyes on for just a moment. He reviewed where he had left off, talking about Washington, and ended the paragraph and the letter as quick as he could manage. The ink did not look too bad, despite that he had slept on it. It was still reasonably legible, and he had sent worse letters. While it did not excite him to be babysat by Lafayette all day, that was his command, so that was what he would do. He could not control the tasks he would be given, but he would still do them to the best of his ability. He ate the bread and water that had been left for him by some mysterious benefactor, likely named John Lawrence, wishing bitterly for coffee. He gathered his confidence and strength staring at the tent flaps. He stepped outside. As if by magic, Lafayette appeared on his horse in front of the tent. He reached down and dropped a spare coat that had been hanging from the saddle horn to Alexander. "You are late," Lafayette said. Alexander opened his mouth to form an apology. "Good. That means you are improving. My father used to say sleep is a key element for improving one's health." Had he just been complimented for sleeping late? Perhaps nearly dying from fever should be a more common event. "Wear my spare jacket. The general will be extremely unhappy if you die under my watch. Did you eat breakfast?" "Yes, sir." "Good. We'll be inspecting the camp for most of the day. There's some paper and a pen in my saddlebag for you." Alexander put the jacket on and retrieved the items without noting this was usually a task assigned to General Washington. The jacket was surprisingly warm and a little big, though he reflected it might look too odd if he were to properly button it. He was not, after all, a major general. He at least had the sense to remove the bright gold epaulets. Their work started. He had been on several of these types of inspections with Washington, and he knew them to usually go a lot quicker than this one was going. He thought of suggesting they hurry, but Washington's fury from last night and the threat of insubordination stopped him. It was fine all the same, because occasionally he would be too dizzy and would have to put his hand on the flank of Lafayette's horse, pen falling from his grasp. Once things got a little blurry, and only surreptitiously sitting down and suppressing the forceful urge to vomit stopped him from losing consciousness. But the Marquis was patient, and at no time did he suggest they hurry or demand he speed up. Instead, the Frenchman lingered and caught up on gossip and boasted about France and talked about nothing while Alexander put himself back together. He could not help but be jealous of Lafayette's seemingly endless well of energy, especially when every step, more and more, became an immense challenge. It was enough like working that he didn't complain. "You'll never find a nurse as caring as the Lieutenant Colonel," Lafayette said as they ate lunch in his tent. In addition to their usual bread and whiskey, he had procured some sort of special French bread, which Alexander was too exhausted to point out tasted suspiciously and familiarly stale. They also ate dried meat, which he strongly suspected was horse jerky. Chewing was a surprising effort. "My lords?" he repeated without thinking, because pretending that Lawrence was anything but his was a daunting effort with so little energy, especially given that the Marquis was his close friend. But talking about Lawrence was one of his favorite things, so he did not complain about the odd way to start the conversation. "He is the most dearest to me, and hopefully I him. I know without question I would provide him the same exquisite care I am sure he provided for me." "Your Lawrence? Oui." Lafayette gave him an odd sort of look, like he was prepared to dispense with some sage advice for Alexander, despite that he was actually younger. He knew that Lafayette was wealthy and educated, but it didn't make it smart any less when Lafayette pretended he had so much more life experience. He waited for the Frenchman to say something condescending. There was nothing. "Is there something about Lawrence I can shed some additional light on?" he said in the uncomfortable silence. "No, I know him quite well." This was true. When Lafayette could escape his duties, he was one of their regular drinking partners. "I was simply commenting on the quality of the care." "I see." There was something unsaid about Lawrence here that Alexander was having a hard time understanding in his current state. He had a feeling he was being insulted, but it was difficult to identify, nonetheless take the next step. He turned the conversation over in his head a few times, trying to untangle the words and identify the deeper meaning. Lafayette cleared his throat. "Will you write me help a letter to my wife? With luck, she will think me as eloquent as you are and fall even deeper in love with me when I return a war hero. Is this Washington's way to get me to write more letters?" Lafayette looked at him for a second, and then uttered a surprised laugh. "You are speaking to a man who crossed the sea against the wishes of his father-in-law, and against a law specifically created to stop him from joining this war. Believe me when I say I am the last person who will demand you write letters to your relatives. But I have read your work, and I now have the opportunity to put your vast talents to my advantage." He cleared up the food and their utensils as he spoke, then poured each of them a small glass of wine. Then he reached into a chest and pulled out a pen and some paper. Alexander laughed at the mental image. "Now, what is the best way to express to her our efforts in the war?" "Maybe leave out hungry and freezing?" "Au contraire, Hamilton. We must discuss our misery at length, so she will understand the enormous resilience and endurance of her husband. Also, when I return, she may pay more attention to me, knowing the immense pressure I have existed under for so long." "But what if she realizes that you're accustomed to eating freezing bread and low-quality jerky, so she doesn't provide for you, knowing how low your standards may have dropped?" "That is a good point." That's how it went. This was good practice for Alexander's written French, which was not as good as his spoken French. They would scheme up a sentence or idea that they wished to add to the letter, and then Alexander would add his writing talents to it, growing the idea into a work of art. Then Lafayette would provide him French grammar and spelling pointers to make sure there were no spelling errors in the letter, which of course would be unacceptable. Along the way, he learned more about the Frenchman. His wife's name was Adrienne, and she was the most beautiful, thoughtful, kind woman that had ever been born, according to Lafayette. He was as wealthy and educated as Alexander had already suspected, and owns large tracts of land and several manors. "Do you think she will understand in time why I had to leave her and fight with you and the general?" Lafayette asked in native French as they discussed some battle in the letter. "I came to your aid because I knew it was required of me. My uncle wished for me to take a position guarding some mountain in Italy." He scoffed. "How can a man of any spirit or dignity sit satisfied with one's life staring at a mountain, when they know there is a true fight to liberate free peoples from tyranny? How can one be content staring into a snowy peak, knowing there are most esteemed leaders like General Washington, who still need soldiers? Nowhere other than here does the freedom in men's hearts sing so strongly to be released. I knew then, as I know now, that this war is sewn into my destiny as threads are sewn into one's coat. I hope she will understand I did not go so far to hurt her or our children, but that I had to come here. It was not optional." Alexander was vaguely aware of a charmed smile that had grown upon his face. He was not accustomed to being the dazzled in the order-crowd relationship. He was accustomed to dazzling. "I am proud to know a man of your character, Lafayette," he replied a little slower, making sure his French made sense. It provided him a good opportunity to gather his thoughts. "You are a truly magnificent example of a man, and your courage, discipline, integrity, and spirit reflects the revolution more accurately than many born here." Lafayette laughed. "Alexander, if I may be so personal, please. You, the general, and the many others I have grown to know and think of fondly only prove to me that I was destined to be a part of this cause. I would not meet men of such exemplary character had it not been meant to be. And, if I may add, it would be a great loss both personally and to the cause to see you leave us. I understand why the general is how he is about you." "Your compliments honor me more than I can say," Alexander said, a genuine smile on his face. "But about your wife, I am sure she will understand and support your cause, especially as I imagine you intend to return significantly wealthier and with more renown. In addition, you will be the wisest husband in France. No one will know more about the glorious new nation across the sea." "I hope so," he said in a doubting voice. But he took a breath and steeled his expression into something more resolute. "Please finish this up and we will check the weapon stores, the stables, and report to the general. What is a good end?" Perhaps you could summarize the depth of your longing for her on account of her wit, beauty, intelligence, nobility, and any other positive characteristics you can think of. Certainly these droll continentals do not compare." Lafayette laughed and scribbled at the bottom of the letter. Then he blew on the ink to dry it and put the folded letter in his pocket. "I hope you will visit me in France after the unrest there is settled. I don't know when that will be, but I hope it will be soon. You would be most welcome. Perhaps you could bring your wife and Lawrence." You could hardly imagine a more wonderful vacation. It seemed like having Eliza and Lawrence in one place might be too much for his heart to handle. He dared just for a moment to imagine this event, staring at the beautiful French countryside, drinking high-quality wines with Lafayette, Lawrence, and his wonderful wife. If there is not too much to be done, and it is safe, it would be my greatest honor. But I would have to be the luckiest man on the continent for such an event to occur. Lafayette smiled a sly little smile. "You are a very lucky man, from what I have already heard and seen," he said, and he put his jacket on and buckled his saber to his belt. The supply numbers were dismal, as usual, but sitting down and writing the letter had added some energy to his stride. He handed off the 2 letters to the messenger postman and said a prayer that Lafayette's letter would be able to get across the sea. It seemed like an eternity away to him. He could only imagine how homesick Lafayette felt in those quiet moments where one's mind was not otherwise occupied. He certainly missed Eliza, but she was only a few days away if he hurried. Adrienne would be months and months of sitting on a ship held captive by the wind for them to be reunited. The distance only compounded the level of respect he had for the Frenchman. "Wait out here. Don't run off and accomplish anything monumental," Lafayette said as they approached Washington's tent. "I can't go inside with you, sir?" The announcement took him a little by surprise. "That is correct, Lieutenant Colonel. It shouldn't be long. Watch my reins." He fought the frown away and nodded, looking at the horse he was holding. The poor thing looked as cold, hungry, and miserable as the rest of them. He gave the horse a consoling pat on the neck, then turned to study the camp. Perhaps if he was lucky, he would be dismissed earlier to find Lawrence and catch up with him. Even considering the brief conversation they had had yesterday, it was the smallest they had talked in a long time. It always set Alexander's mind at ease to break down his going-ons of the day and hear feedback. Lawrence always had something helpful to add or some insightful comment to make, or was able to point out something in his story that made everything clear. Lawrence always had good ideas about what an action or phrase or decision meant. He tried to see if he could see his friend anywhere, but he came up empty-handed. He was cold and tired, despite that he'd barely done anything. His head felt foggy, and he closed his eyes to try and resettle his thoughts. He had half a mind to stroll around the side of the tent and eavesdrop on what the 2 men were talking about. How could it be anything but him that they would exclude him from the conversation? They were talking about his illness. They had to be. Washington trusted him with everything else related to the war. He'd heard things he knew could never be repeated. But the subtlety involved seemed too difficult for his current state, and plus he would never get away with such an action while watching Lafayette's horse. And leaving Lafayette's horse was obviously out of the question. He forced his thoughts back to clarity as the tent flaps ruffled. "Major General, Excellency," he bowed his head as Lafayette and Washington exited the tent. "You have your orders," Washington said to Lafayette, who took the offered reins of his horse and saluted the general. He offered a wave to Alexander, then clucked his tongue and led the horse away. This had the unpleasant side effect of Alexander having to stand on his own, which suddenly seemed challenging. He locked his knees and forced his legs to hold him. The alternate option, collapsing in a heap in public in front of the general, was utterly unacceptable. A brief hope that he might do something important rose in his chest now that he was just him in Washington. This cleared his fogged head a little and sharpened his focus. "Son," Washington started, which dashed the hope entirely. Washington never called him son unless he was going to give an order Alexander wasn't going to like. "Look at me." Alexander raised his eyes to meet the general's face. Washington looked tired and worn, but Alexander could see the fire that burned in those eyes. That fire was the reason they would win. That fire would power them away from oppressive tyranny and into a future where they could craft something new and wonderful. That fire was the fire of the revolution. In the face of such a flame, it was hard to turn away.
Go to your tent. I'd go to sleep. That's an order. I'll send Lawrence to look after you. Do not argue with me. Dismissed.
The general strode into the tent without another word. Alexander stood there for another moment, and with a resigned sigh, turned and headed back towards his tent. He grudgingly admitted to himself that closing his eyes for a few moments sounded marvelous, and might help out with his aching bones and his fogged head. He did not, however, think it would be better than being ordered to see Lawrence. He found their ragged little tent in the rows and stepped inside. The flimsy fabric didn't hold much heat, but it did a decent job of protecting them from the sharp breeze. He studied their collective mess with satisfaction before dropping into his chair and reviewing the essay he had been mid-paragraph before the last march. He had been writing about the government. He paused for a few moments to recover the train of thought, then began to write. The pen seemed heavy, though, and the words blurred together if he looked at them for too long. He was having trouble remembering the issue he had been discussing. He put the pen down and rubbed his eyes. Maybe if he just laid down for a second, he would be ready to finish the essay. He laid down on his bedroll and pulled Lafayette's spare coat more tightly around him, along with his shabby blanket. The complex concepts slipped further away instead of coming closer, but trying to reach out to them just made them sneak further away.